We're getting all the panelists settled up here, and I just want to take a moment to introduce Robyn Blumner, who is the moderator of this panel this morning for us. Robyn Blumner is the executive director of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, which makes her an awesome choice for moderating a panel on supporting science in lawmaking. Prior to that, she was a regular columnist for the Tampa Bay Times, and prior to that, she served as an executive director for two different state affiliates of the ACLU. First, the Utah affiliate, and then the Florida affiliate. So she has both executive directing experience, lawmaking, lobbying experience, and science experience, making her a fantastic person to have moderating our panel. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Robyn Blumner as the moderator of our Supporting Science and Lawmaking panel, and she is going to introduce our other panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. And let's give Amanda a round of applause. So, good morning, everyone. Everyone can hear me, I assume. I'm thrilled to be here to moderate this very important subject, supporting science and lawmaking. Yes, I'm Robyn Blumner, Executive Director of the Richard Dawkins Foundation. I'm kind of a newbie to the movement, arriving in February from 16 years prior as a columnist and editorial writer with the Tampa Bay Times newspaper in Florida. But in 2004, I wrote a column for the newspaper, and it was titled, "I'm an Atheist, So What?" And so ever since then, I've been sort of Florida's resident atheist, which I wear proudly, of course. So reason and science are why we're here today. And as most of you know, scientific illiteracy is rampant in the United States, which contributes mightily to backward and skewed public policy. I said this yesterday, 46% of Americans tell pollsters that human beings arrived on this earth within the last 10,000 years fully formed. It's just, shockingly, aggressively ignorant. We routinely elect politicians in the United States who say that the earth is 6,000 years old because their religion tells them that this is true. And yet, we have almost no one elected to political office in the United States who openly rejects the supernatural and who says that they subscribe to an evidence-based view of the natural world. This is the 21st century. American competitiveness depends on science literacy and our ability to progress technologically. How can we do this with those kinds of shocking statistics? The result of all this is obvious and dangerous. Climate change denial is arresting action on the central problem of our age, even as the clock is ticking. We had a recent president, George W. Bush, who limited stem cell research because of his concern for the life of human embryos that could fit inside the brain of a fruit fly. Yeah. We have a U.S. Senator, Marco Rubio of Florida, a man who has presidential aspirations, who refused to say in an interview with a magazine that the earth is billions of years old. Why? Because he was afraid that it wouldn't play well at a Republican primary for president. Still today, we have in this country public school biology teachers who will teach creationism, or at least dumb down evolution, so they don't get into trouble, so there's no controversy with the local school board. So, what do we do about it? Well, luckily we'll have the answer today, because we have a group of preeminent experts to discuss it. So let me introduce them in turn. They'll each have a few minutes to introduce themselves, their organizations, and then I will moderate a discussion for about a half hour, and then we'll open it up for about 20 more minutes to questions from you. So start thinking of your questions. All right, to my right is Angela Ledford Anderson, who is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. To her right is Erin Heath, Associate Director of Government Relations at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And finally, we have Mercedes Gore, Executive Director of the Blavatnik Awards for Young Scientists at the New York Academy of Sciences. So let us begin with our
Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you today. I am proud to work for the Union of Concerned Scientists. We are not actually a union, but we are a fabulous group of scientists and citizens who put rigorous science to work to solve our planet's most pressing problems. The group started as an alliance between faculty and students at MIT in 1969, and we now have over 400,000 members and an expert network of over 20,000, and we certainly invite you all to join. I have the pleasure to direct the Climate and Energy Program at UCS. It's a very exciting program, and we're more all the time. I think we are at a critical moment when it comes to climate change. Lots of ups and downs, as those of you who've been following the issue know, but I think we're on an upward swing. UCS actually pioneered the notion of the renewable energy standard at the state level. They now exist in 29 states, and we're promoting international solutions as well. We have a very exciting upcoming decision moment in Paris in 2015 to hopefully come up with a new climate, we'll call it treaty, but a new international climate agreement that will really have the U.S. joining the world in a commitment to reduce emissions. Our role is to mobilize those citizens and those citizen members and scientists to engage in those particular issues of the day and really bring some really solid analysis. And one of the best things we do is translate the science for citizen lobbyists like yourselves. So we'll be doing a lot of that, particularly around the new EPA rule, which I hope to talk to you about as we get into Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erin Heath. I'm Associate Director of Government Relations at AAAS. Very happy to be here. AAAS is the world's largest general scientific society. We're very active in areas like science and policy, science education, science and national security, and science diplomacy, and we also publish the journal Science. What I do is I work in the Government Relations Office. We essentially serve as the liaison between the government and the scientific world. So we try to educate members of Congress and their staffs and other members of government about science and try to let scientists know what's going on in government.
Hi everyone, I'm Mercedes Gore, and I'm happy to be here. I'm very excited. I've never been to a function like this before, so this is my first time. I work at the New York Academy of Sciences. It's a very old institution. It's been around since 1817. It is not really an academy, just like in that members aren't elected. Anyone can join. So our 22,000 members are fans of science, as well as scientists and scientists of renown as well. Nobel laureates are on our board and advise us. The core mission is to advance scientific knowledge, promote science-based solutions to global problems, and to increase the number of individuals in society that are scientifically informed. So we have public programs that we run where we send graduate students and postdocs to grade schools to show them that not all scientists look like Doc Brown from Back to the Future, but some of them are actually young and can speak normally in plain language and make science fun. So that's one of the missions. My particular program, the Blavatnik Awards, is a new program, relatively new. And we are attempting to emulate the Nobel Prize, but we're giving prizes to scientists who are 42 years and younger. And the reason for that is we'd like to make scientists famous when they can still relate to a lot of people, the public. That they don't all have, their fame behind them and their discoveries decades ago, that their best work is still ahead of them. We'd like them to be the faces of science. So that's the mission of the award.
Okay, well, thank you. So it's nice to see a bunch of ladies up here. So you all have, as part of your brief, to try to convince public policymakers to support science. So tell me what your biggest obstacle is in that regard.
Well, from my perspective, I think one thing that I've learned over the years is that facts are not always persuasive. So scientists are very difficult to understand, but we think we have the facts. That's all we need, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. And so, what we need to focus on more and more, I think, is two things. You have to hit people where they live. So it's local impacts, and it's also telling stories. I think in a lot of cases, stories are what people remember. And I guess one other thing I would add is that even for those who are champions of science, it's a very difficult climate right now. There's a lot of partisan gridlock, and it's a very tight budget.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I think that social science is as important as what we call hard science or physical science in this regard. When it comes to politicians, I think our bigger problem is the political system, and we can go on and on about that. But and we should come back to that. But I think in terms of really building the kind of support we need to get science-based policies through, you really have to appeal to people's values as much to their heart as much as their head, I guess. And it has to be in a frame that is familiar to them. So we are finding exactly the same thing. We are seeing huge differences in communicating about climate impacts because sadly now we can see them. They're observable, they're here, and they're getting worse. So that I think is going to be the key over the long run. When it comes to politicians, I think it's sort of the same boat. We are hoping to give those politicians who do understand the facts and the realities, the pathway that they need to be able to move out of the corner, essentially, that I think many of them have backed themselves into in this ideological fight over climate change, which is really quite ideological and not fact-based. So I think I'm hopeful we're seeing that turn. I'm hoping to talk about where and how, but what the challenges still are.
I agree absolutely with Angela and Aaron. I also have to say that in scientific training, we're told not to talk in anecdotes. We're told that the way that you convey and convince someone is that you show them the data and they will be blown away by your beautiful slide. And it doesn't matter how you deliver it. That's all you need. So we needed to kind of readjust that and make scientists comfortable with the idea that that's how, if you deliver in this way, if you deliver your message in this way, it's okay. You haven't betrayed your peers. You are still using scientific language, but you're using it in a more effective way. And I think that's a message that we're learning more and more. I took the policy fellowship that AAAS runs. And this is one of the most life-changing things that I think I did, because I was a scientist, I didn't know how to talk in that way. And then, you get that training and you see an effect. So I think that there are definitely steps and we are moving in the right direction.
So yesterday, 4 rather brave members of Congress came to address our group, which was a huge step forward in credibility and legitimacy for the secular movement. And Senator Whitehouse focused in on climate change in his speech, and he was saying that it wasn't so much driven by religion and religious dogma as by sort of the fossil fuel industry using maybe that at the front to protect its pecuniary interests. And I'm wondering whether that's also what you see in your lobbying efforts.
Yes, and they've been unbelievably effective. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a book by Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt. She takes a look at the history of the tobacco industry and how essentially sowing confusion was the key to their success. And the fossil fuel industry, sort of took that model and did it better. It's so ingrained now that it's almost hard to see. Senator Reid, I think, and Senator Whitehouse have been incredibly brave, along with many of the other Democratic folks in unmasking the Koch brothers. And I got tickled yesterday after I saw their first ad. They're now having to put out kind of branding ads of, we're good for industry, and because their company has really been smeared by their political activity. Not backing off any on the political activity, but I would say that they have really sought to sow confusion, and you see a lot of, but we are seeing movement, and I think what the joy was when the National Climate Assessment came out, and we had all kinds of members of Congress, instead of disputing the science, saying, well, I'm no scientist, and we all went, yes, that's so anyway, when there's time, if we have time in Q&A, we are doing some really interesting research that is going to connect the fossil fuel industry to the actual percentage of global greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere today. A good friend of ours, Rick Heaty, with the Climate Accountability Institute, has documented the 90 entities, about 13, 14 of which are investor-owned companies, mostly based in the U.S., that are responsible for 2/3 of the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere today. And the science of how do you attribute specific impacts or the specific degrees of global average temperature increase has grown so much that we're going to be to the point soon where we can say ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell brought you X% of global warming. And I think that's going to really be the reverse.
AAAS does a lot of work with religious communities, in particular evangelical communities, and AAAS commissioned a survey to these communities, and I think the sense that came out of it is that the climate objections are more of a political issue than a religious issue.
So let me ask you how we can get our organizations to cooperate on maybe one step removed issues, such as school vouchers, school choices, sort of like pro-life. Those kinds of terms undercut really what this is about, which is to redirect taxpayer money, underwrite religious education. And the kind of education you often get in religious schools is not the full-blown science curriculum you would get in a public school, but maybe a lesser approach, a weak T approach, for instance, to biology, where there's an overlay of creationism and of course Congress is on a tear now, at least the House, to redirect quite a bit of federal money towards underwriting private school education. Might the scientific world understand that they have common cause in preventing that kind of thing from happening with the secular world as well?
Yeah, I mean, what I generally say to these kind of questions is the way to get at this is to get engaged. And I do a lot of work to try to help get the resources out there for scientists to get engaged with policymakers, with the media, with the public, in terms of education issues. Run for school board. That's one amazing way to get involved. Sometimes it's starting a teacher education program. We're finding that a lot of teachers don't teach evolution because they're not comfortable with it. They're worried about wading into the controversy. So now there are workshops all over the country to try to alleviate that. And the other thing, and as I said, we do reach out to evangelical communities, and I don't know how that's going to play here, but I think that's a very important piece. We have to have a dialogue with those communities.
Well, what do you do? I mean, how do you reach out? Where's your common cause?
So in our case, we have a program called the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. And so we have partnerships with the National Association of Evangelicals. We also have a program to try to get science education into seminaries. And we do a lot of public education events and surveys, like the one I mentioned before. So that's how we get at it.
And what kind of success rate have you had?
You know, success is hard to measure. And, you know, obviously, these bills are still out there, these bills that challenge science education in the States. But I do think that it does seem that we're making inroads, and we need to continue that.
Anyone else want to talk about having a step beyond science and larger public policy issues that will impact scientific literacy?
I mean, I have maybe a couple of examples of this. So we, at the Academy, and I mentioned this before, is we have a mentorship program. And we call it the STEM pipeline. So we encourage graduate students and postdocs, people still early in their careers, scientists, to go into schools, and the program is public schools, right? To act as mentors. And they often advise on science projects and things like that. Now, this is the first exposure that they have to the current state of science education, usually. What we have been seeing, though, as they've gone through their careers, and they then have children of their own, and they are making decisions about where to send their kids, they start to question whether the public school system is enough. So those kinds of issues where it does hit them personally. So I think maybe beyond just as my role in society as a scientist, I should weigh in on education policy. I think we have to remember that scientists we are people too, and the things that will get them to take that extra step usually is something that's a little bit more personal. I mean, just from my observation, amongst my peers and my community. So I don't know. I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but I kind of feel like if there is, at least amongst the people that I know, that kind of activism or that kind of attention gets paid when it's relevant to themselves.
So why do you think, 90 years or so after the Scopes monkey trial, we still have such a huge proportion of Americans that don't believe in human evolution, at least? Where does that come from? Okay, what can be done about it?
Well, okay. I hate to put it on scientists because, but we exist in an echo chamber often. As I mentioned before, we get trained to talk to each other, not to people outside of our. I'm a biologist. I have a hard time talking to a physicist. So it's not even a question of taking the next step and being able to talk to someone who isn't scientifically trained. I think that more of an effort to have scientists who are capable, who are willing and able to do this well. You have the Neil deGrasse Tysons and the Brian Greene. So
And Richard Dawkins.
And Richard Dawkins. I saw him talking. That was one of the first science communicator type things that I'd seen with Caltech, and it was actually that was a long time ago, and I still remember that talk. And I just had this conversation with a Nobel Prize winner, and I said, what is our problem? Why do we have such a high percentage of Americans who still don't believe in evolution? And he said, well, look what we've done to the people that are communicators. It's just recently that we've started to look at them and say, these are people that scientifically that we should emulate. In the past, we've said, well, yeah, they're kind of pop scientists. The real scientists are the ones getting the Nobel Prize. You don't see them standing in front of podiums at a pub and trying to deliver science. We're seeing a difference now. We're starting to see the value of being a good communicator, and in addition to being a top scientist. So I do think that that's part of it. We need to not be so happy with just being so alien in this society. We need to look and talk like other people so that people can hear our messages and believe us, and not think that we're in Monsanto's pocket, and not think that we're in Wyatt's pocket. There are things that are now part of being a professional scientist, and that's just the reality of it. So that's me on my soapbox.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I will also say that a lot of the bills that we see challenging evolution education or climate education are driven by a handful of individuals, maybe even one individual. And these people are very passionate. Honestly, we probably can't persuade them. But it does leave, I'd like to think, a large portion of the population that could possibly be persuaded if we reach them.
So I'm not a scientist, unless you think politics is science, which is debatable. I just think that there have been, if you look back on history, there's been periods of anti-intellectualism, and it tracks our economic situation. And so I think when we're in a period right now, if you this is purely a theory, but I think the income inequality that we're looking at the country and the widening gap means that those folks on the lower end of the spectrum, and Dan Kahan does a marvelous job at Princeton of talking about this, there's a tribalism that has grown up in our society that contributes to our the polarization of communication and of politics. And I think there's just a real fear of intellectuals and elites. And you combine that with what has not been the greatest education system in the world, and you end up with, it's easy to just grab onto what you hear your pastor say, or to various movements that make you feel comfortable, included, and hopeful. And so I agree that we can do a better job communicating science to folks with those values, and I think we've learned a lot of those lessons. And but I think it is tight. It is not. You can't look at the issue in a vacuum. I think there's a lot of other things going on societally that's contributing to that phenomenon.
That's a good answer. Thank you. All of you. So I'm interested to know what the premier issue is that you're grappling with. Now, of course, for you it's climate change. You can talk a little more about that and how you're going about it. But I'd like each of you to talk about the issue that's on your front burner right now.
So I can go a little deep. So on climate change, right, we have some immediate opportunities, so we want to seize those. And one is, the first ever regulation of carbon dioxide from power plants was released by Gina McCarthy last week. 13 years I've been working for that. Candidly, I mean, we're so, it's going to be a long slog to get it implemented, or to make sure it stands, to get the states to implement it, et cetera. So, we're not done yet. We need to strengthen it. It can be and will be stronger. So that's the opportunity side. I think the other, the thing that keeps us up nights is that the prevailing theory around global warming has been that what we needed to do to avert the worst consequences of climate change is to stay below a global average temperature degree of 2 degrees, and we are at 1.6, and emissions keep rising, even with these sorts of impacts, and with some tremendous strides in some of the developing countries in Europe. Our chief scientist, Peter Frumhoff, authored a paper a few weeks ago that really said it's time for us to take a look at this in a new framework. Our traditional just push harder for new policies to reduce as fast, and let's get on a war footing, and all the things that all of us activists have said are still possible. And really it's between 2020 and 2030 that's going to save the day, that's going to see where we end up, basically. So we still have time. But the big science debates we're having to open up and think about are what do you do about adaptation? What do we do about the consequences we can't avoid anymore that are locked in? how do we look at and think about geoengineering, which has so many potential adverse impacts in itself? What kind of trade-offs are we going to have to wrestle with now, given our failure to act sooner? So those are some of the internal discussions that we have in terms of how do we stay science-based and cutting edge in really tackling the problem.
So on the subject of climate, AAAS just recently came out with a report called What We Know, which essentially says what we do know about climate change. And one of the things from the report that struck me was 1.6 degrees might not seem like a lot, but if your child has a temperature that goes up 1.6 degrees, you worry. So think of it like the human body. In terms of the issues that I deal with, I do handle the evolution and climate education in the states issue. It crops up particularly every spring, and these bills, as I said, just do not go away. They've changed over the years. I think, as you said, it's been 90 years since evolution's been challenged in a high-profile way. Since the Dover trial in 2005, it was ruled that intelligent design is unconstitutional in the science classroom. So the recent bills, the most common are the so-called academic freedom bills. And these will encourage teachers to have their students analyze and critique certain scientific theories and look at what they call the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses. We don't think evolution is a particularly weak theory, but okay. In the beginning, these bills would often single out evolution. Increasingly, they have added climate change to the mix. Or they don't single out anything, but that is still the intention. And climate has really, I think, kind of erupted as a point of challenge in recent years. So that's something that I think will continue to grow. So I'm worried about this. I lose sleep over this.
The main thing that my program focuses on, or the main issue that we look at, is science funding. And on top of just, particularly in biomedical research, the cuts that have happened over the past decade, the recent challenge to the peer review system at NSF has been particularly worrisome for scientists, and this idea that Congress should be able to impose standards on what is good science and what is not. I'm not sure if I've seen something like that before, certainly during my lifetime. But it looks like it has some serious support. I think that's the last I looked at it a couple months ago. But it's something that we don't know what to do with at this point, I think, because it does have this sense of, well, there's, if we do support, if we're advocating for funding and the increase in funding, but it comes with all of these ties, what are we faced with then? Do we then say, we're going to find other ways to fund our work? The awards program that I run is a program that gives funding unrestricted to the individual scientist. We don't even give it to the institution, we actually give it to the individual. Just because we don't want them to be faced with having to make a decision about what it is that they're going to pursue, based on the politics of even their institution. It's a small thing in the bigger, in the bigger scheme, because there are a lot of scientists out there who are imperiled by this kind of legislation, but that's certainly something that we can do.
Okay, and on that note, I think I'll open it up to the audience for questions. How about this? Whoever has the microphone wins. We'll let the microphone come around, and wherever it lands, that's who.
So one thing that is apparent to me is that we have been attacked by the other side, by the right-wingers, for a long time, saying, we're skeptical of this, And what I would wonder is it valuable to, instead of being pushed back onto our hind foot, to attack them and say, I take your attack of global warming science the same way that I look at the science of cigarette, tobacco lobby, and with the same result. And, you know, and challenge them on saying, this is in your financial best interest, that's why you're arguing for it. And then also say, and what if you're wrong? You know, because that's something that we get all the time on this God thing. But why not go for it on the science? Because what if they're wrong? It's really awful.
So I don't know that I would use the word attack. I would say speak up. I think, as I've said, you know, the key is to get engaged, to tell these stories, and to get in. And there are many, many ways to get engaged. You're all here, so you're already engaged, which is great. I applaud you all. And this is just one way, coming to DC. You can also get involved locally, as I said, run for school board, or just write a letter to the editor of your local paper. I mean, there are many, many ways to do this.
But you don't think the challenge is the way to go?
Well, as I said, I'm a pretty strong believer in trying to find common ground. I think that's the way to go. I know people disagree with me, but that's the way AAAS approaches it.
It seems that a lot of the
Speak into the mic, please.
Yeah, I don't think it's working for me either, was it?
Oh, that's.
I was yelling.
Okay. Do we not have a mic?
Thank you.
Okay, why don't
We
you
can
just,
talk
why don't you just speak up?
Speak up. Repeat the question. It seems that a lot of the reasons that we have such kind of reactionary members of Congress is that they're in safe districts that are, you know, that kind of thing, because of gerrymandering. I was wondering if anyone is working on a more scientific, fair, nonpartisan way of gerrymandering districts that could be pushed by scientists, because it would have a positive effect in maybe getting more reasonable people into office. I was wondering if there are any groups working on that, or yeah.
Bravo, great idea. I like that.
It's so funny you say that. We were just on a staff retreat, and on the way home.
Can you repeat what the person said?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, of course. He was mentioning the fact that part of the reason we have such, in his words, reactionary members of Congress is because they're in safe districts. And the safe districts are largely a result of gerrymandering and redistricting. And is anyone studying a more science-based method of redistricting? So I don't know if anyone else is doing it, but it's a great question. And we were just discussing on the way back from our retreat, UCS created about 2 years ago the Center for Science and Democracy. And at one point, 3 of my staff turned around, they were discussing with themselves, and they said, don't you think the Center for Science and Democracy ought to take up redistricting? That I heard this from you all in the crowd, and it's not just my staff trying to push work on somebody else's program. But we will be happily. I think it's a terrific idea. I think there's probably lots of groups, and we do a lot on science and how science should affect policymaking, but we're a little light on the democracy side. So I think it's a really terrific idea.
All right. Sorry, I can't see name tags right now, and because we're having mic problems, I'm just gonna stand by the person who's speaking next. Maybe.
Mercedes, my question to you is, you mentioned that facts don't change minds all the time.
That was Aaron.
Or that was.
But I agree with
Sorry.
that.
I apologize. So, when we speak about facts and scientific facts, one of the experiences I had yesterday in speaking with regards to climate change to the legislative analyst was that the science is still out. Their science hasn't proven because of this 3%. 97% of scientists agree that climate change is happening, there's a human cause. How do we discredit that 3% and get the general public that has a lack of critical thinking skills, understanding for true peer-reviewed science to come to that conclusion that this is BS and this is really what matters. How do we help that as individuals? What can we do to foster that? Because, or what should we do? So, I know that's a big question.
No, it's a good question. It's a great question. It's something that actually we do struggle with, because any scientist will tell, well, no self-respecting scientist will ever say 100% certainty about anything. 97% is great. I mean, we test drugs based on way less than that. You don't have,
statistical significance, and I don't think people understand. I come from a healthcare background. I understand, statistical significance and probabilities, but there's many individuals that don't have the knowledge or understanding of science and critical thinking to understand that when you have that kind of statistical significance, it makes a difference. And how do we get that to people by...
Oh, one thing I'll say, I was a journalism major way back when, and when I was in J school, it was drilled into us to tell both sides of the story, tell every side of the story. And then you get into the real world and you find that there aren't always really two sides to every story. And I feel like when I first started following the issue of education, I would see articles which gave equal time to both evolution and intelligent design when that wasn't the reality that the science was reflecting. I feel like I'm seeing that less now, and so I think reaching out to the media is just one way to get at this. And we actually, AAAS has a mass media fellows program in which we bring scientists to work at newspapers and magazines and other media outlets for a summer. And I think that's one way to approach it, is to actually get scientists in the door at those media outlets.
So I was trained as an activist and how to spin journalist. So we learned the art of pivoting. And I think when someone comes at you with the 97, with the 3% it's not proven article, you can very quickly say, with all due respect, congressional LA, your boss makes decisions on far weaker science than that all the time. What's really at issue here is, are you going to protect your constituents from the impacts that are here and getting worse? And so that pivot into a frame that makes them responsible for dealing with the results of that science is the thing that we are trying to improve upon, and working with local officials to do more emergency responders, really get those folks that they can't ignore, and using, again, those experiences, the data of what's really happening, not so much the theory of climate change.
It's already on.
Great. Thank you. My name is Gleb Saborski, and thank you for the panel and the presentation. I think this is great, and I especially appreciate the last comment, the last conversation about how do you get actually people to engage in critical thinking. And everything that I've heard here has been really terrific on pointing out the benefits of critical thinking on this broader social level. Something that I'm passionate about, and I actually co-founded a nonprofit devoted to teaching people how to think critically on an individual level. So pointing out to them the benefits of critical thinking in their individual lives. Kind of how do you actually think probabilistically about events that occur? How do you think using reason-based evidence on an individual level? And that's something I haven't heard in the conversation yet. I think it's something that may be missing in the broader secular movement. If you tie people's individual decision-making to scientific thinking, probabilistic thinking, evidence-based thinking, they will inevitably apply that to society in general. So can you talk a little bit about that level of education? What do you think about this kind of engagement of getting people on an individual level to think in an evidence-based fashion? And I can talk a little bit about my work in this fashion as a professional educator. I'm a professor at, so Yeah, I was just kind of curious what you think about this timing of society to the individual.
Take away the Game Boy. I think in order to achieve that kind of level, so I'm married to an analytical philosopher, and we talk. You know, we try to compete about who can be more literal and analytical about everything. But it does take, I think, the teaching that way of being, right? That's not just thinking, it's just being, is, I think that's a combination of education. I think it's a combination of how you're raised, like what your priorities are. If you have, I am amazed at how many gadgets one child can have going at one time. And I would be shocked if there was any kind of critical thinking going on aside from hitting that pig with that bird or whatever that is. You know, so I think there's something kind of culturally that needs to happen. I don't know, because that seems like a really lofty kind of goal. That's maybe
Let me
pessimistic.
just follow up for a second.
Sure.
So, of course, leaders matter, right, in any culture.
Absolutely.
And do you think demanding more critical thinking of our politicians might be a start towards modeling behavior for the rest of us?
I would love to see that. I mean, you know, so Rush Holt was kind of our AAAS policy hero. He was a fellow, and we thought, gosh, if Congress were full of Rush Holts, we'd be in a much better place. But, you know, can we populate Congress with across the board? I don't know. I mean, that's up to you guys, I think. It's up to
Thank you.
Hi. One of the most useful classes I took in my engineering curriculum was an advanced public speaking course. And that has helped me greatly explaining recurrent flooding and sea level rise down in coastal Virginia, where we're getting hammered, Norfolk especially. My question for the panel is, what would you recommend to help create the next Neil deGrasse Tyson? Somebody who makes science more interesting, more digestible to the community at whole.
So was this course an elective or a requirement?
I took it.
So that's I think the issue. I would really love to see more communications training integrated into our science and engineering programs. I think that would go a long way.
I think I mentioned it before, there's also needs to be kind of a shift in values within science as a discipline itself, and not looking at, you know, it's not just how do you write a grant application or how do you write an abstract. By the way, you are seeing a little bit more of, so there are journals now, scientific journals that are requiring scientists to write a lay version of their abstract. These are not, you know, these are well-respected, terrific journals. So certainly that message that scientists who want to be, you know, responsible members of their profession need to know how to be good communicators. And if that were in the curriculum, that would be a great message.
Bravo, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda Kniep, and I work for American Atheists in New Jersey, which in the near future will be under a lot of water. One of the things that we found yesterday when we were lobbying, and I found, is that members of Congress and even senators want specifics for their state, so they can, you know, if they're going to do legislation. You all seem like wonderful resources yourselves as well as your organizations, and I'm hoping that this means that the SCA and our member organizations will get to have stronger communication. Are there specific things that we can go to your organizations and get statistics, like how the poor will be disproportionately affected, or minorities, or our states, so that we can take those numbers and that information back? Because just as a layperson, when you go to the internet, it is hard to find that information.
So I think that's a great point. We are We don't have it yet, but we are putting together a series of state fact sheets that will have the best data we can find, state specific. A big part of the problem is a scientific one in that the impacts of climate change have been measured on a much broader scale than that, and getting actually downscaled projections to, a state level. If the National Climate Assessment was done regionally, and in part because of the state of the science, but it is getting better, and NOAA is doing more and more downscale research. So it's actually quite a task to get it down to state or, God forbid, congressional district, which is really what they want, right? If you're lobbying the House. But we are going to move that and we'll probably do around 12 states this coming year and more the following year. But we're finding exactly the same thing.
Do any scientific groups do congressional scorecards?
Right. Yes.
Wow.
Yes, Society for Neuroscience.
Here.
I think they do scorecards.
Overall for science, not just for particular issues?
I know that they comment on how various members of Congress vote on neuroscience and like funding of NIH issues. I don't know about global science.
Well,
The thing is,
I'm just saying, it would seem to me that would be helpful for lay lobbyists.
Can we request that as a goal?
it is to an extent, but from
Action
my
item.
perspective, scorecards are kind of a mixed bag, right? I mean, part of our job is to try to reach out to these members of Congress who aren't science champions. And so if we're giving them an F grade, they're not going to be open to even talking to us. So that's just something to consider when you're talking about the scorecard idea.
All right, just really quick, we're gonna get a question from Chandler and then one more question before we allow Robyn to wrap up the panel.
Good morning. I'm a guest here and not a member, so I apologize if I'm inappropriate. I'm engaged in a project. I'm real nervous. I'm engaged in a project that promotes critical thinking. I get emails from Erin. I get emails from the young lady on the right, always asking for money. I apologize, I've never returning those mails. And so I get asked to a lot of gigs like this. Kelly asked me how I got here. I really couldn't answer her, but I wanted to say thank you so much, because last month, in April actually, I went to a gig for STEM, the culture of STEM, and the panel was all middle-aged white males. This is a fabulous event, and I just wanted to acknowledge the powers that be for a fabulous event. Thank you.
Okay, so the final question, right? So Ron.
Okay, I'm sorry I had to step out for a while, so hopefully this isn't repetitive. But apropos of the recent couple of questions, there are organizations like the League of Conservation Voters that do congressional scorecards. And you can look up your representatives and senators on all kinds of issues related to the environment, including climate change and how people have voted. So that's one resource. They also have reports and things that are sometimes more accessible to people that don't have a lot of scientific training.
Do you want to make a final question? Okay.
And I will be very brief. Thank you, you're awesome. Can you give those of us, parents in particular, who would like to raise the next little Neils, any resources that we can take to our schools and or our school boards to help to make our aim something that's tangible and that we can actually do? Websites are good, please, thank you.
So AAAS has something called Project 2061 that focuses on science literacy, and it lists benchmarks of science literacy. I think that would be a great resource to check out. They were involved in the Next Generation Science Standards.
Okay, well, I want to thank very much our eminent panelists, Angela,